In 1211, at Chabchiyal Pass, Mongol commanders Jebe and Gyaganek won a battle by doing what no textbook would ever recommend: they ran away. Not a tactical withdrawal. Not a feint covered by shields. A visible collapse. Riders scattering. Supplies abandoned. Gold left on the ground. The Jin army pursued. Confident. Organized. Certain the enemy had broken. Minutes later, the Mongols turned. Forces that were supposed to be fleeing reappeared from the flanks. The pass closed. The Jin formation dissolved. The destruction was decisive. Why did a professional army abandon its defensive position to chase a retreating enemy into broken terrain? Why did experienced commanders mistake disorder for defeat? And why would the Mongols stake an entire campaign on the assumption that their enemy would stop thinking the moment victory seemed close? Because this was not a clever trick. It was a strategic wager built on psychological pressure, internal discipline, and a risk most commanders would never accept. In the next sections, we will dissect why this strategy should not have worked, why it almost failed, and what it truly cost to execute. This episode is not about Mongol cavalry speed, composite bows, or battlefield agility. Those explanations are comfortable and insufficient. The real strategic problem faced by the Mongols in northern China was structural. They were fighting fortified forces that relied on terrain, static defense, and numerical stability. Direct assault favored the defenders. Prolonged siege favored the defenders. Even harassment favored the defenders once supply lines stretched. Conventional options narrowed quickly. So the question is not why the Mongols used deception. Deception is common in war. The real question is why they chose a form of deception that deliberately dismantled their own appearance of control. The strategy examined here is fundamentally unorthodox because it inverts a core military assumption that cohesion must be preserved at all visible times. Jebe and Gyaganek accepted temporary loss of cohesion, at least in appearance, in exchange for something far more valuable: control over the enemy's decision-making process. This was not a plan designed to overpower Jin forces. It was designed to make Jin commanders abandon their own advantages voluntarily. That choice carried consequences. It required absolute internal discipline. It exposed the Mongol force to irreversible failure if a single assumption proved wrong. And it demanded that commanders tolerate the possibility that history would remember them not as strategists, but as men who ran. This episode asks a narrow but uncomfortable question. What kind of military system allows its leaders to intentionally look weak at the most dangerous moment of a campaign? To answer it, we must first understand the situation that made every normal solution impossible, and why retreat became the most aggressive option available. Before any decision could be made, the Mongol commanders faced a battlefield that actively resisted initiative. Not because it was chaotic, but because it was stable. The confrontation at Chabchiyal Pass was not a clash between equal systems. It was a collision between two strategic logics that valued control in fundamentally different ways. On one side stood the Jin forces, territorially anchored, defensive by doctrine, confident in terrain and fortifications. On the other stood the Mongols, mobile, numerically flexible, and operating far from any fixed logistical base. The Jin objective was simple and conservative. Hold the passes. Deny penetration. Force the enemy into costly frontal engagements or prolonged exposure. Every hour the Mongols failed to break through strengthened Jin confidence that time itself was an ally. For the Mongols, the objective was the opposite. They did not need to seize ground permanently. They needed to rupture the defensive logic that kept Jin forces static and protected. A breakthrough was not a geographic event. It was a cognitive one. The terrain made that task brutally difficult. Mountain passes compress movement. They restrict cavalry. They reward defenders who can hold elevation and depth. For an army accustomed to fluid maneuver, this environment removed its greatest advantage. Speed no longer translated into dominance. Initiative no longer guaranteed momentum. And then there was logistics. The Jin forces operated close to supply networks. Reinforcements could arrive. Losses could be absorbed. Mongol detachments, by contrast, relied on operational tempo and local acquisition. A stalled campaign was not neutral, it was fatal. Every delay increased vulnerability. Every failed probe narrowed future options. time was not merely passing. It was closing in. Politically, the pressure cut both ways. Jin commanders were under orders to prevent breakthroughs at all costs. Defensive success reinforced their legitimacy. There was no incentive to pursue aggressively. Holding position was rewarded. Caution aligned with command expectations. Mongol commanders had no such luxury. Their authority depended on results. Not symbolic resistance, but decisive disruption. A stalemate favored the enemy strategically, politically, and logistically. Under these conditions, the normal options began to collapse. A frontal assault would bleed cavalry against prepared infantry. A prolonged standoff would starve mobility. A withdrawal would concede initiative and invite pursuit on unfavorable terms. What remained was a shrinking corridor of possibility, narrow, dangerous, and deeply counterintuitive. Yet the Jin command believed they were winning. From their perspective, the situation looked stable. Defensive positions held. Enemy probes failed to achieve breakthroughs. Mongol forces appeared restless, unable to commit. The battlefield reinforced Jin assumptions: patience would prevail. This belief created the most important condition of all: complacency disguised as discipline. Jin commanders did not expect the Mongols to relinquish control voluntarily. Their entire mental model of warfare assumed that cohesion, once lost, meant defeat. Disorder was interpreted as weakness, not deception. That assumption mattered. Because the Jin command structure was rigid. Orders flowed downward. Initiative was constrained by hierarchy. Tactical flexibility existed, but only within the framework of strategic caution. When opportunity appeared obvious, however, the system encouraged exploitation. Victory, when it seemed within reach, activated incentives. This was the blind spot. The Jin were trained to resist pressure, not temptation. Their doctrine prepared them to endure. It did not prepare them to question sudden advantage. The Mongols understood this asymmetry. They recognized that Jin discipline functioned optimally when defending. But discipline under perceived advantage behaved differently. Pursuit required decentralized decisions. Momentum created gaps in communication. Units advanced at different speeds. Terrain magnified fragmentation. A retreating enemy did not merely invite attack. It invited interpretation. And interpretation was where control could be lost. From the Mongol side, this insight did not simplify the problem. It sharpened it. Because exploiting this blind spot required something extreme: the deliberate performance of failure. Not partial withdrawal. Not controlled fallback. But visible disintegration. This introduced new constraints of its own. A retreat convincing enough to trigger pursuit had to appear authentic. That meant abandoning material. That meant exposing flanks. That meant accepting real losses. It meant trusting that discipline could be restored at a precise moment, under pressure, without external signaling. The margin for error was microscopic. Too orderly, and the Jin would hold position. Too chaotic, and Mongol units might not reform. Too slow, and pursuit would stall. Too fast, and the trap would fail to close. Everything depended on timing, perception, and internal coherence under the appearance of collapse. This is where the strategic map becomes unforgiving. The Mongols were not maneuvering against terrain alone. They were maneuvering against expectations embedded in another army's institutional logic. They were betting that the Jin command system would behave predictably under perceived success. But predictability cuts both ways. If the Jin resisted the temptation to pursue, if they maintained discipline, the Mongols would have exposed themselves for nothing. Retreat would become reality. Initiative would vanish. The campaign could unravel. This was not a clever exploit with a safety net. It was a commitment to a single hypothesis: that success would make the enemy careless. Understanding this environment is essential. Because without it, the decision that followed looks bold. With it, the decision looks desperate. And desperation forces a choice. Either accept strategic stagnation and eventual attrition, or attempt to break the system by attacking its assumptions rather than its formations. And that is why the Mongols began considering a move no conventional doctrine would ever authorize. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It codifies what usually works, under conditions that are assumed to be repeatable. At Chabchiyal Pass, those assumptions quietly collapsed. If a conventional commander had assessed the situation faced by the Mongols, the recommended options would have been limited and cautious. Textbook logic would argue for three paths. First, probe and disengage. Test the defenses. Identify weaknesses. Withdraw before committing fully. Preserve force integrity. Second, fix and contain. Apply pressure at multiple points. Force the defender to disperse. Look for gradual erosion rather than breakthrough. Third, avoid decisive contact. Maintain mobility. Refuse battle on unfavorable ground. Wait for a better opportunity elsewhere. Each option values preservation over risk. Each assumes time can be traded for advantage. At Chabchiyal Pass, none of them worked. Probing revealed nothing new. Gene defenses were layered and patient. There was no exploitable collapse point. Every attempt to test strength merely confirmed the same reality: the terrain neutralized Mongol strengths. Fixing the enemy in place failed for a different reason. Gene commanders were not required to respond. Their objective was not to maneuver, but to deny movement. Pressure did not force mistakes, it reinforced caution. Avoidance, finally, carried its own strategic cost. Withdrawing to seek alternative routes conceded initiative. It allowed Gene forces to redeploy, reinforce, and harden future positions. Mobility without penetration achieved nothing. The doctrine assumed flexibility on both sides. The reality was asymmetry. The Gene could afford to wait. The Mongols could not. This is where the textbooks become dangerous, not because they are wrong, but because they assume equilibrium. They assume both sides suffer equally from delay. They assume time is neutral. For the Mongols, time was corrosive. Every day without breakthrough increased logistical strain. Every pause signaled limitation. Every unsuccessful maneuver educated the defender. Under textbook logic, caution preserves force. Under these conditions, caution preserved failure. This created a strategic contradiction. If the Mongols followed doctrine, they would maintain cohesion but lose momentum. If they forced action, they would have to violate the very principles designed to prevent disaster. Most commanders resolve this contradiction by choosing the least catastrophic loss. They accept stalemate. They disengage. They wait. Jebe and Nek did not. The reason is not recklessness. It is prioritization. They identified that the true center of gravity was not the pass, the terrain, or even the Gene army. It was the Gene command's confidence in positional superiority. Textbook warfare focuses on defeating the enemy's capacity to fight. This situation required defeating the enemy's decision to remain static. Doctrine offered no solution for that. There was no prescribed maneuver for inducing an opponent to abandon a winning position voluntarily. No formation for triggering pursuit without provocation. No safe method for weaponizing the enemy's optimism. To achieve that effect, the Mongols would have to present something doctrine explicitly forbids: apparent loss of control. This is where most plans die. Because doctrine exists not only to guide action, but to protect commanders from blame. Following accepted principles provides cover when outcomes are uncertain. Breaking them exposes the decision-maker completely. A failed assault can be justified. A cautious withdrawal can be defended. A deliberate collapse cannot. Choosing to run, visibly, would leave no room for explanation if it failed. That is why this strategy was not merely unconventional. It was institutionally unacceptable. And yet, it was the only option that addressed the actual problem. The Mongols did not need the Gene to be weak. They needed the Gene to believe the Mongols were. That belief could not be induced through pressure. It required theater. But theater in warfare is unstable. It depends on precise timing, perfect internal discipline, and an accurate reading of human behavior under stress. Before such a plan could exist, it had to overcome resistance from within. Because the most dangerous opponent to an unorthodox strategy is not the enemy. It is the commander's own system. And that is where the real decision began to take shape. This strategy did not emerge fully formed. It had to survive internal resistance before it ever reached the enemy. Within any military system, proposals that deliberately abandon visible control trigger immediate skepticism. Not because they are irrational, but because they violate the unwritten contract between command and order. Authority is expected to stabilize chaos, not simulate it. The idea attributed to commanders like Jebe and Nek was radical not in concept, but in implication. It suggested that the Mongols could gain more by temporarily surrendering the appearance of superiority than by defending it. That implication mattered. Inside the command structure, this was not a question of tactics. It was a question of trust. A plan built on staged collapse demands absolute confidence that every subordinate understands not just what to do, but when to stop pretending. There is no evidence of formal debate transcripts. But the fault lines are clear. One camp would have seen the proposal as operationally elegant. The Mongol army had practiced maneuver, dispersion, and regrouping for years. Feigned retreats were not unknown. What was new here was scale and exposure. This was not a localized trick. It involved committing the visible bulk of a force to an action that looked indistinguishable from defeat. The opposing view would have focused on irreversibility. Once the retreat began, there would be no pause to reassess. No signal to abort without confirming failure. Communication during motion would be limited. Dust, noise, and terrain would fragment awareness. If even a fraction of units failed to reassemble, the entire formation risked disintegration. This was not risk in the abstract. It was structural risk. The commanders proposing the plan were not ignoring this. They were accepting it. That acceptance rested on a small number of core assumptions. The first assumption was psychological. That Jin commanders, upon observing disorder, would interpret it through doctrinal bias. They would see collapse, not orchestration. They would believe pressure had succeeded. The second assumption was institutional. That Jin command incentives favored exploitation over restraint once advantage appeared obvious. That pursuit would be encouraged, not questioned. The third assumption was internal. That Mongol discipline was deep enough to survive the moment where everything appeared to fall apart. This last assumption was the most fragile. A feigned retreat is not just acting. It is resisting instinct. Every soldier is trained to survive. Running under pressure activates fear responses. Reversal requires trust that others will reverse at the same moment. No signal flare could guarantee that. No messenger could outrun confusion. The plan depended on shared expectation rather than direct command. That is a dangerous foundation. So why accept it? Because the alternative assumptions were worse. If the Jin did not pursue, the Mongols would disengage with losses but preserve force. The campaign would continue under constraint, not collapse. If the Jin pursued partially, the Mongols could still disengage without committing reserves. Only one outcome was catastrophic: a full pursuit followed by Mongol failure to reconstitute. The commanders were not betting on chaos. They were betting on predictable human error under perceived success. That distinction matters. This was not deception aimed at information. It was deception aimed at behavioral momentum. The Mongols were not trying to hide their strength. They were trying to overload the enemy's decision loop at the moment discipline usually weakens. And that brings us to the real target of the strategy. It was not Jin soldiers. It was not Jin formations. It was the Jin command's belief that advantage must be seized immediately. The retreat was designed as a trigger. Once pulled, it would activate pursuit protocols, reward-seeking behavior, and fragmented command execution. The Mongols would then re-enter the fight at a moment when the enemy's cohesion, not their own, was compromised. This reframes the decision entirely. The Mongols were not abandoning control. They were transferring it, temporarily, to the enemy, knowing the enemy would misuse it. That is why this decision sits outside normal doctrine. Doctrine assumes control must be retained. This strategy assumes control can be loaned, and reclaimed violently. But assumptions do not execute themselves. Once the decision was made, it had to be translated into action under conditions that punished hesitation and amplified error. Paper logic would not survive first contact. Because the next phase was no longer about ideas. It was about execution, and everything that could go wrong once the retreat began. Once the decision was made, the strategy entered its most dangerous phase. From this point forward, success no longer depended on insight, but on timing, discipline, and restraint under extreme pressure. The retreat had to look real. Not symbolic. Not partial. Convincing enough to override caution ingrained through years of defensive doctrine. This meant visible disorder. Units breaking formation. Riders accelerating unevenly. Supplies abandoned where they could be seen. Not hidden caches, but objects meant to be noticed. Evidence of haste. Evidence of loss of control. This was not improvisation. It was choreography under fire. The retreat unfolded in stages. Forward elements disengaged first, drawing attention. Supporting units followed with deliberate inconsistency, some faster, some slower, to break pattern recognition. The goal was not speed, but persuasion. Jin observers needed to conclude, independently, that the Mongol line had cracked. Here lies the first failure point. If the retreat appeared too clean, it would trigger suspicion. If it appeared too chaotic, units might not regroup. The line between the two was thin and unstable. Communication during this phase was minimal by necessity. Sound carried poorly. Visibility was limited. Signals risked exposure. Each subunit relied on prearranged expectations rather than real-time command. This is where logistics became a weapon and a liability. Abandoning material was not symbolic theater. Some losses were real. Equipment left behind could not be recovered. Pack animals released or killed to speed movement. This imposed a tangible cost on the retreating force and ensured that the performance could not be easily reversed if pursuit did not materialize. The Mongols accepted this cost to buy credibility. At the same time, concealed elements positioned themselves along likely pursuit routes. These were not reserves waiting passively. They were timed components in a mechanism that required synchronization without direct contact. Their role was precise: remain invisible long enough for pursuit to overextend, then emerge decisively. If they revealed themselves too early, the Jin would halt. If too late, the retreating units would be overwhelmed. This introduced the second failure point: temporal alignment. The entire operation hinged on shared assumptions about distance, speed, and reaction time. Any miscalculation, terrain slowing pursuit, unexpected caution, or overzealous advance, could break alignment. There were moments where the plan nearly collapsed. Pursuit did not begin instantly. Jin commanders hesitated, assessing whether the retreat was genuine. This hesitation compressed the window. Mongol units had to maintain the appearance of panic longer than intended, increasing internal strain. Then pursuit accelerated unevenly. Some Jin elements advanced faster than others. This created pockets of pressure where retreating Mongol units risked direct engagement before the trap was set. At least once, the distance between retreating units and concealed forces narrowed dangerously. A premature clash here would have exposed the entire plan. Discipline held, but only just. The most critical moment came at the turn. This was the irreversible point. Once Mongol units halted and reformed, there could be no retreat. Momentum shifted violently. Units that had been fleeing had to pivot into coordinated aggression under maximum stress. There was no signal visible to the enemy. The change had to appear spontaneous. Confusion had to flip sides instantly. This was the third failure point. If any unit failed to reverse, the illusion would shatter. If the enemy regrouped faster than expected, the window would close. If concealed forces were delayed, the retreat would become a rout. But the Jin pursuit had already committed. Formation integrity had degraded. Command distance had stretched. Initiative had fractured downward. When Mongol units turned, they did so into an enemy no longer operating as a single system. What followed was not a conventional engagement. It was a rapid collapse of coherence. Jin units found themselves isolated, compressed by terrain, and struck from multiple directions. The strategy worked, but not because it was clean. It worked because it forced the enemy to make several small, reasonable decisions in sequence, each of which narrowed their options, until reversal became impossible. This is the hidden reality of execution. The plan did not succeed because everything went right. It succeeded because enough things went wrong, on the enemy's side, at the right moments. But execution alone does not explain outcome. To understand why this collapse was decisive, we must examine the other half of the equation: how the Jin interpreted what they were seeing, and why their reaction followed the worst possible path. Because the Mongols did not defeat the Jin army directly. They defeated the Jin command's interpretation of events. By the time the Jin command recognized that something was happening, the most important decisions had already been made, by momentum, not by orders. From the Jin perspective, the initial signals were unambiguous. The Mongols were disengaging under pressure. Their formations were dissolving. Material was being abandoned. These were not subtle indicators. In Jin doctrine, they meant one thing: the enemy had lost cohesion. This interpretation did not arise from incompetence. It arose from training. Jin commanders had been conditioned to read disorder as opportunity. Their defensive doctrine emphasized patience until the enemy weakened. When weakness appeared, initiative was expected. Hesitation at that moment could be interpreted as timidity, or worse, disobedience. The command system incentivized exploitation. Reports moved upward describing Mongol retreat. Each report reinforced the same conclusion. No contradictory signal arrived. There was no evidence of ambush. No counterpressure. No feigned counterattack. Just withdrawal. At that point, restraint became harder to justify than pursuit. This is the first critical error, but not a tactical one. It was a cognitive one. The Jin command interpreted the battlefield through a single lens: linear causality. Pressure leads to collapse. Collapse leads to victory. That sequence had worked before. It aligned with doctrine. It aligned with experience. What it did not account for was staged failure. Once the order to pursue was issued, control fragmented immediately. Pursuit is not a defensive action. It reverses the logic of command. Units advance at different speeds. Terrain dictates spacing. Communication lags. Initiative shifts downward, often to officers operating on incomplete information. The Jin command structure was optimized for holding ground, not for chasing a disintegrating enemy through broken terrain. As pursuit deepened, the first structural weakness appeared. Units began to outrun their command radius. Visual contact replaced coordinated signaling. Decisions were made locally: continue pressure, seize abandoned supplies, close distance. These were all reasonable actions in isolation. Together, they produced overextension. The second error followed naturally. Confidence accelerated behavior. As the Mongol retreat continued, Jin units interpreted the lack of resistance as confirmation. The possibility of deception diminished with every unchallenged step forward. At this point, the Jin were no longer evaluating information. They were validating a conclusion already reached. This is where doctrine becomes dangerous. Defensive systems train commanders to recognize threat escalation. They do not train them to detect when success itself becomes a threat. By the time Mongol units reversed direction, Jin formations were no longer mutually supporting. Spacing had widened. Terrain compressed movement. Some units had paused to consolidate gains. Others pushed ahead aggressively. The command no longer acted as a single organism. When the reversal occurred, it violated every expectation. The enemy that had been fleeing did not merely stop. It reconstituted instantly. Units that had appeared scattered moved with purpose. Flanking elements emerged where none were expected. For the Jin, this was not a tactical surprise. It was a conceptual one. Their mental model of the battle no longer matched reality. Orders issued moments earlier, advance, press, pursue, were now catastrophic. Units could not disengage cleanly. Terrain that had seemed advantageous for pursuit became restrictive under counterattack. Attempts to regroup failed because regrouping assumes shared understanding. That understanding had already collapsed. This is the decisive moment. The Mongols did not defeat the Jin by superior force concentration alone. They defeated them by forcing the Jin to cross a point of no return, where the logic governing their decisions no longer applied. The trap closed not because of perfect Mongol execution, but because Jin command behavior became predictable under perceived success. The Jin did not lose because they were reckless. They lost because their system functioned exactly as designed, under the wrong conditions. And once that realization set in, it was already too late. What followed was not merely defeat, but disintegration. But the outcome raises a harder question. If this strategy worked by exploiting systemic behavior, then its success came with consequences, some immediate, others delayed. Because strategies that rely on error do not eliminate cost. They redistribute it. And that brings us to the result, and the price paid on all sides once the illusion collapsed. The immediate outcome was decisive. The gene pursuit collapsed into fragmentation, and fragmentation turned into destruction. Once the Mongol counter-movement locked in, there was no clean disengagement available to the gene forces. Units that had advanced confidently now found themselves compressed by terrain, struck from multiple directions, and unable to re-establish command coherence. What had looked like a controlled advance minutes earlier became a sequence of isolated fights, each one unwinnable on its own. From a purely operational perspective, the Mongols achieved exactly what they needed. A fortified defensive system was broken without a frontal assault. A positional advantage was neutralized without siege. A campaign that risked stagnation was forced back into motion. But stopping the analysis here would be dishonest. Because the strategic success concealed a set of costs that are often omitted precisely because they complicate the narrative. First, the human cost. A feigned retreat does not spare lives by default. Retreating units are exposed. Rear elements absorb pressure. Any delay or misstep turns performance into reality. Some Mongol losses during the withdrawal phase were unavoidable. These were not calculated casualties in a controlled exchange. They were the price of credibility. On the gene side, the collapse was not orderly defeat. Once command cohesion failed, casualties accelerated. Units were destroyed not because they lacked courage, but because coordination vanished. This kind of loss leaves lasting institutional scars. Survivors do not simply recover. They carry mistrust of orders, of momentum, of apparent advantage. Second, the logistical cost. Material abandoned during the retreat was not theatrical excess. Some of it could not be recovered. Equipment lost reduced operational depth in subsequent engagements. This mattered because Mongol campaigns relied on sustained tempo. Every loss narrowed margin for error later. There is a tendency to treat deception as cost-free brilliance. In reality, deception consumes resources permanently. Third, the political cost. For Mongol commanders, success validated authority, but in a fragile way. A strategy that works once does not automatically become doctrine. It becomes precedent. And precedent invites imitation. This is dangerous. Subordinate commanders, observing the outcome, may attempt similar maneuvers without the same discipline, timing, or situational fit. When such attempts fail, the cost is not merely tactical, it is institutional credibility. Within the gene command structure, the consequences cut differently. Defeat under pursuit damaged confidence in offensive exploitation. Future commanders became more cautious, sometimes excessively so. The system adapted, but not always optimally. Finally, the psychological cost. For the Mongol commanders who ordered the retreat, this was not a clean victory. They had crossed a line few leaders willingly approach, instructing their own forces to appear broken. Even when successful, such decisions leave residue. Trust is strained. Authority becomes conditional on outcomes. A strategy that requires soldiers to believe in collapse, even temporarily, demands repayment afterward. Reasserting confidence is not automatic. It must be rebuilt deliberately. And there is a deeper cost still. This strategy works only while it is rare. Once enemies expect deception, retreat loses persuasive power. Once retreat becomes ambiguous, it no longer triggers pursuit. The very success of the tactic accelerates its obsolescence. That means this victory contains its own expiration date. If the gene had resisted pursuit, if discipline had overridden temptation, the Mongols would have gained nothing but loss. The same maneuver that shattered an army would have weakened their own position irreversibly. This is the uncomfortable truth. The strategy did not succeed because it was universally sound. It succeeded because it aligned perfectly with a specific opponent, in a specific context, at a specific moment. Outside that window, it becomes reckless. Which forces us to confront the final question. If this was not a repeatable formula, not a doctrine, and not a guaranteed path to victory, then what exactly was it? And what does it really tell us about how unorthodox strategies work, when they work at all? This strategy is often summarized too simply. A feigned retreat. A deception. A trick that worked. That description misses the point. What the Mongols executed at Chabchiyal Pass was not a tactic designed to defeat enemy forces. It was a strategy designed to reprogram enemy decision-making under pressure. The battlefield was not the primary arena. The command loop was. At its core, this was a strategy of induced misalignment. The Mongols did not attempt to destroy the Jin army directly. They created conditions in which the Jin command system would destroy its own coherence. The retreat was not the action. The pursuit was. This reverses a fundamental assumption in most military thinking, that initiative must be held, not surrendered. The Mongols treated initiative as a temporary liability. They relinquished it deliberately, knowing the enemy would misuse it. That is the first principle this strategy reveals. Unorthodox strategies do not seek advantage immediately. They seek to delay advantage until the opponent commits irreversibly. The second principle is more unsettling. This strategy worked because it exploited how success alters behavior. Most military systems train extensively for adversity. They develop protocols for loss, pressure, and threat. Far fewer train for the moment when victory appears imminent. That moment is often governed by emotion rather than procedure, urgency, ambition, fear of missing opportunity. The Mongols understood that discipline under pressure and discipline under advantage are not the same skill. They did not need the Jin to panic. They needed the Jin to hurry. That distinction matters. The third principle concerns risk. This was not asymmetric warfare in the sense of minimizing exposure. It was asymmetric in where risk was concentrated. The Mongols accepted near total operational risk up front, in exchange for a binary outcome later. Either the enemy collapsed, or the campaign did. There was no gradual failure mode. This is why the strategy resists institutionalization. Militaries prefer scalable methods. This was not scalable. It was situational. It depended on culture, doctrine, terrain, and timing aligning precisely. That makes it powerful and dangerous. So can this strategy be repeated elsewhere? Only under narrow conditions. The enemy must value positional advantage strongly enough to pursue once it appears lost. Their command system must reward initiative under success more than restraint. Their doctrine must interpret disorder as weakness, not ambiguity. And one's own forces must possess internal cohesion strong enough to survive simulated collapse. Remove any one of these conditions, and the strategy fails catastrophically. That is why attempts to generalize it usually end in disaster. This was not a lesson in deception. It was a lesson in strategic empathy, understanding not just what the enemy can do, but how they are likely to think when they believe they are winning. The Mongols did not outfight the Jin. They outpredicted them. And that leads to the final, uncomfortable insight. This strategy does not prove that breaking the rules leads to victory. It proves that rules exist because breaking them is usually fatal. The Mongols survived breaking them because their system, culturally, disciplinarily, psychologically, could absorb that shock. Most cannot. Unorthodox strategies succeed not because they are clever, but because they are rare, context-bound, and brutally honest about risk. When they work, they look brilliant. When they fail, they leave no excuses. Which is why history remembers the victory, and quietly forgets how close it came to erasing the commanders who chose it. At Chabchiyal Pass, the Mongols did not win by appearing strong. They won by convincing their enemy that strength had already collapsed. That distinction is the heart of this episode. This was not a story about mobility, cavalry, or speed. It was about control, who held it, who surrendered it, and who lost it forever by assuming it could only move in one direction. The Mongols understood something rare, that sometimes the fastest way to break an enemy is not to pressure their defenses, but to invite them to abandon them voluntarily. But such invitations come with a price. They demand discipline under humiliation. They demand trust without reassurance. And they demand leaders willing to stake everything on an assumption about human behavior. That is why this strategy still unsettles military historians. Not because it was clever, but because it forces an uncomfortable question. How many victories depend less on strength, and more on the moment an opponent stops thinking carefully? And how many commanders are willing to risk everything to find out?